Hello and welcome back to another video. Today we are going to be continuing our series in talking about psychopaths. So I've got some new insights and some new things. And today we're going to be talking about the Dominator, which is the specific sort of item that brings our previous topics together. So without much further ado, I'm going to get into it. So this is part 3, of course. We're talking about the Dominator, which is pictured here. The Dominator is a pretty common sort of thing that's associated with the show. You can actually buy a replica of it, which I've almost done multiple times just for the fun of it. But this is sort of an iconic piece of the Psychopaths franchise, and it really ties together the other components that we've talked about. In fact, I really started this series wanting to talk about the Dominator itself, but really felt like it was necessary to go over the other pieces first so we would have more context. So today, when we talk about the Dominator, we are going to be talking about 3 different areas here. We're going to talk about the function of the Dominator. We're going to talk about the usage of it, so how does it get used in the series. And we're going to talk about the philosophy behind the Dominator. And these 3 things hopefully will sort of enlighten the ideas of, in what ways it relates to current world psychology and, crime and things like that, but also where this comes from in an academic sense, in a fictional sense, right? So let's talk about the function of the Dominator. So the function of the Dominator is essentially to serve as almost like a proxy for a firearm, as you would in today's law enforcement kind of situation. The Dominator itself is actually billed as sort of a portable scanning system for determining one's psychopaths using the Sybil system, which is why you'd see we have to talk about the previous things. But basically what happens is the Dominator, it's handheld, you give it to somebody who is authorized to use it, you point it at somebody, and it reads their crime coefficient and gets their psychopaths, gives you all that data, which it does through the Sybil system. So in actuality, this isn't so different from other items that are used in the Psychopaths universe, scanners and things like that, drones. But the Dominator is specifically billed as something that diagnoses and then allows a decision to be made. And what I mean by that is when you point the Dominator at somebody that is maybe at risk to commit a violent crime, it has a built-in system where it allows you to subdue and or kill the person that you are aiming at. And this is why the Dominators are only given to authorized users. In fact, only the people that are in the sort of Public Safety Bureau are really allowed to have Dominators. And there are other exceptions, obviously, but the most people we see are sort of a proxy of law enforcement, right? And these are people that are authorized by the system to use the Dominator on people that it might be necessary to do so. And there's a lot of fail-safes and a lot of interesting things built into the Dominator. So, for example, the Dominator will only stun someone, if they have a crime coefficient that is elevated enough that they are a threat in the near future to someone. Otherwise, the Dominator won't even fire. You can't accidentally shoot someone with the Dominator, would be the logic. And if someone is really at risk imminently or has committed a violent crime or is dangerous, the Dominator switches to a lethal mode that straight up just kills whoever you aim it at. And this is sort of meant to be a last-ditch resort. It has to be somebody who is extremely dangerous, and then the Dominator will allow that utility. And the idea here is that the Dominator is sort of this executing agent of the Sybil system, which in some ways even takes the user out of the equation because the Dominator is the thing that actually makes the decisions. So that's sort of the function of the thing. I will say that there's some interesting parallels here between both being a tool of sort of defense and destruction, but also of healing and of help. So the Dominator bills itself as like a diagnostic, which doesn't exist in the real world, right? You can't scan somebody's psychopaths in the real world, but it would be really interesting to do so, right? You would save a lot of time, you'd save a lot of money if you just had a device that you could point at somebody and it says, hey, this person's depressed, hey, they're anxious, hey, they're violent, non-violent, That would be an amazing tool. And the Dominator is sort of a wish fulfillment of that in some way. But also that it is married with an aspect that it's like a firearm. It's like a tool of defense or of aggression. And in fact, even almost takes that comparison one step forward by saying a Dominator can't be misused. It can't be misfired. at least goes the internal logic of the show, because they can be. But the Dominator is a totally safe alternative to those kinds of things, because you can't hack a Dominator. In fact, the whole system doesn't work if the Dominator goes offline somehow. So if you enter a place where you don't have signal and it can't connect to the system, the Dominator becomes useless, which of course is a limitation, but is also a failsafe, right? It's a lockdown. And I think that's an interesting thought, because, there's a lot of critique in law enforcement and mental health communities around, there are people who are maybe scary seeming or erratic when you go to encounter them. And that leads to a lot of incorrect usages of firearms, or a lot of people getting hurt when they shouldn't. And so the Dominator in some ways is a response to that critique, that there can't be accidents, that only people that society, read the civil system, but society approves of, can be targets of the Dominator, which is something we'll talk about a little bit later. So let's talk about the usage of the Dominator. So the Dominator in the first picture up top there it's in its standard state. You can see that it looks almost exactly like a gun, except with some cool sci-fi stuff going on with it. But that's the default mode. You take it out of the drone container that has it, you pick it up, that's what it looks like. It, in that case, is locked. You can't fire it. And that is also what the non-lethal mode looks like. So the original form of the Dominator, the trigger's locked and can't be used unless the scanner identifies somebody that has a crime coefficient that exceeds 100 points, meaning that they are likely to commit a violent crime, or at least are more likely than average, let's say. And it must be used by someone who's registered and authorized to use it. A random citizen cannot pick up a Dominator and use it. Again, goes the internal logic. This is to guarantee that there's no abuse of the system, no innocent victims, which of course you might recognize there are blind spots here that assumes that the civil system and that the psychopath system can't be gamed themselves, which, is a plot point of the series, obviously, but worth mentioning. The second photo is the lethal mode of the Dominator, where it opens up and allows you to use it as a weapon. And in this case, you can use the previous version as a weapon, but it will only stun someone. It paralyzes them so you can take them in, non-lethally and safely. The lethal version opens up, glows, and in this form will kill basically anyone you pointed at, with some exceptions because of things like armor or vehicles or things like that. Using the lethal version is restricted to someone who has a crime coefficient of 300 or higher. And this is per the show, but I got the information from the Psychopaths wiki. But this is, someone who is significantly dangerous, that has killed somebody, will likely kill or attack somebody in the near future. And so the system says, okay, you'd be justified in using force against this person because it would save a life, potentially, would be the logic. And this is interesting because, there are set barriers, there are set safeties involved, and those make sense. Those are important. But, of course, the Dominator is an imperfect tool because it's designed to be used with systems that are imperfect. But there's a lot of interesting pieces in how it gets used. So, for example, you can point the Dominator, get an easy, quick read of, like, this person's safe, this person's not. And in fact, the Dominator won't allow you to use it if the person is not a valid target. And it tracks things, which is very interesting because you can point it and it can pull up multiple signals. And I'm sure there's a limitation on that. But, you'll see pieces in the show where they're looking at maybe 2 or 3 different targets, and the Dominator can distinguish between them, which is very interesting because, it's supposed to be reading people's psychopaths, and so it clearly has the technology to distinguish between people. And that's sort of the usage, the utility of the Dominator in the show. I will say that often there's like another mode that gets used in the show that's used to destroy like vehicles and armor and things like that. But it's less common. There's also another form of the Dominator that's in at least one of the movies, and I think maybe the later seasons or some of the games or something, that's more like an assault rifle. It's meant to be like a long-range version of a Dominator that's more intense. And so there's sort of the continued parallel to a firearm here, right? That there might be circumstances where you need a modified Dominator because you would need a modified firearm in that case, right? But that's the usage. So often the goal here is to take people in non-lethally, but obviously there are times where, criminals will be killed by the Dominator because they are just, too dangerous to take in. And interestingly, if you use the Dominator and it goes to lethal mode, it actually doesn't revert to non-lethal mode unless you literally separate it from the user, the person that you're going to use it on leaves the field of vision. So there's a lot of weird, you can't go back. You can't be less lethal once it activates lethally. So you can't even change modes, which is interesting from philosophical perspective, which is what we're going to talk about next. So let's talk about the philosophy of the Dominator. So the Dominator is an interesting tool because it follows very logically, in a lot of ways, from the previous things we've talked about. If you have a whole system set up to read people's psychological states, it makes sense that the stationary ones that you have, and there are moving ones too, like drones and things like that, but that you would need something that's handheld that can be carried on a person that can give you precise, quick measurements. And that's the Dominator in a whole, right? The Dominator, the idea is you give it to the right people, the people that are mandated and bonded and good to go to have this power, and you hope that they use it responsibly. Now, this is interesting because all the people that work in the public safety thing can use the Dominator, but there are people among the Public Safety Bureau who themselves have high crime coefficients and so then would be fair game for Dominators, which is funny because you actually see that used on people. So like there are people carrying weapons for whom the weapon could be used against them, which is an interesting philosophical piece, and there's sort of something there that I'm maybe not qualified to talk about per se, but it would be interesting to think about. Another piece of the philosophy of the Dominator that I find very interesting is that the Dominator almost takes the human element completely out of the equation. The only thing that the human wielding the Dominator does is squeeze the trigger. They don't make the decision whether to use the Dominator per se, although I guess they could move the Dominator down or throw it away or something like that. But they don't make the decision whether to do non-lethal or lethal. They don't make the decision of what happens to the person when they fire at them. And that's an interesting philosophical distinction between, technology and assessment tools and like a weapon, for example. So you can make the argument that like if you're using a firearm, those choices are in the hands of the person using the firearm. With a Dominator, those choices are not in the hands of the public safety person or the person wielding the Dominator. And, that's worth mentioning because that puts all the power into the hands of the civil system. And as we've talked about previously, the civil system is not necessarily in it for what benefits people. They're not necessarily all good people. Now, you would make the argument that they're sort of philosophically trying to do the most good for the most people, but I mean, you're talking about a system that is made up of people that are sociopaths or who are psychopaths or who have something going on that's deviant about them. And so obviously that makes the Dominator a situation that could be abused, that somebody could use the Dominator in a way that they believe is morally correct because that's what has been told to them. And then what would happen would be that they could have been lied to, that a person could in fact have used it on a victim that wasn't warranted. And indeed the opposite can be true. The Dominator is actually how we find that there are people who are criminally asymptomatic, that you point it, like in the picture, at somebody who has a 0 crime coefficient, and the Dominator can't activate, which could put the person using it at risk. It could put society at risk, right? And interestingly, in that way, the Dominator is also a recruitment tool. Because if you point the Dominator at somebody who has a 0 crime coefficient, that's going to come up as weird. And the people using it are going to notice that. And then what happens, or what can happen, is that the civil system gets involved, brings that person in, adds them to the collective, and then you have new people to determine how the Dominator gets used, which is sort of, the Dominator serves a lot of philosophical purpose in this show, which I think is very interesting because it could be a great tool for diagnostics and for healing and assessment because, assessments can cost hundreds and thousands of dollars in the psychological world, and they can be wildly inaccurate. There are people that take decades to get a correct diagnosis, right? And the Dominator could, fix that in 10 seconds or less. But also that it's problematic and that the Dominator has a lot going on with it. And it's in some ways like a gun and a tool and a technology in ways that are all uncomfortable about those things. The Dominator is all of those things at once and therefore equally as complicated as all of those things, which I think is a very interesting philosophical stance. So let's talk about the final thoughts and some of the problems with the Dominator, right? And some of these will be things I've mentioned before. But final thoughts, I think the Dominator is such a cool, iconic weapon in anime. And for a reason. It has cool visuals, it's animated really well, it's super interesting looking, and it poses some cool questions. It gets used in cool ways. It is a vital part of the show in which it appears. And that's not always the case for weapons and tools and technology and things. Also, it's a really cool reflection of critiques of what the societies we live in today wrestle with. So it's a critique of firearms. It's a critique of a surveillance state and of psychological testing and of health and crime and all of these things. And I think that's a really powerful, interesting thing that the Dominator brings to the table in a way that I don't necessarily see all the time with a lot of different, anime and items in those things, right? And I think in all of that, the Dominator is interesting and worth talking about. And, potentially more so than it gets talked about in the show even. Because I would almost say that the Dominator is, in a lot of ways, the core feature of Psycho-Pass. That, a lot of things revolve around the Dominator in such a way that the other systems really just inform how it gets used, right? So I think that's a really powerful and cool thing. So I really love the idea. Love talking about it, obviously. But the problems, right? So the problems are the Dominator in a lot of ways is a critique of this modern sort of firearm police, violence kind of thing. And also is meant to appear outwardly as a tool of safety. Because philosophically what happens is if a person kills somebody with a Dominator, they didn't make the decision to kill that person. Not really. The philosophical stance that gets taken in the show is that society wanted that person dead, deemed that them being killed would be okay in that circumstance. And, it says society, but really it's the civil system. And so the Dominator reflects a sort of oppression, a sort of some people at the top, or, if you don't want to say at the top, but at the top, that are mysterious, that have no accountability, that are not elected, that are making decisions about who lives and dies. And in that way, the Dominator is a critique of sort of modern society, right? That it's a proxy for power that gets wielded over people, seemingly with their consent, but often not with their consent. And I think that's a problematic piece about the Dominator, and something that I think is really worth talking about, because I love the idea that they handily roll all of this up into one item. And again, I think it's endlessly fascinating that in order to live this perfect civilized life, to have a great society, that everyone just has sort of agreed that there are people that don't belong in the society that should be killed. And they've given that power over to a system that is self-interested, that has itself to, look out for. And all systems do to some degree, but it's almost increasingly nefarious because it's supposed to be a technology and it isn't. The Dominator is a technology, but it's acting upon the will of people. And that becomes very scary, right? Because the Dominator could be a really great tool if you use it for good things. If you had a non-gun version of a Dominator, just like a scanner of some sort, that did the Psycho-Pass kind of stuff of it, the Dominator would revolutionize healthcare, would revolutionize psychological care instantly. It would be amazing. But, it doesn't come unproblematically, and I think that's something worth talking about. So anyway, that's sort of my thoughts about the Dominator. I'd love to continue to engage with the topic and with you all in the comments, but I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up. I will see you all next time for another video. Thanks.